The house on Churchill Lane looked ordinary. Neighbors said the woman who lived there, Margaret Boyle, mostly kept to herself. On the night of April 14, 1988, a teenager climbed into that house through a skylight. What followed left the community shaken and later filled a courtroom with questions. The teenager was Eric Vanzant, a 14-year-old from Philadelphia. That night he was charged with a list of serious offenses. These included first-degree homicide, burglary, theft, and other related counts. The case stayed with him for decades. The incident was sudden and caused devastating harm. Police records and medical reports showed that the victim had been harmed in a physical and inappropriate way, and that she suffered severe injuries which ended her life. Investigators said Vanzant went into the home planning to steal and to cause harm. Witnesses and court filings also showed that weeks earlier, in a separate moment of anger, he had smashed the woman's car with a baseball bat. Prosecutors described the sequence clearly. First came the forced entry through the skylight, then the physical harm inside the home. After that came the theft and the escape. These steps became the foundation of the state's case. Why would a 14-year-old do this? Courts and reporters gave a short answer: theft mixed with a readiness to use force. During the pre-trial and trial, prosecutors argued Vanzant entered with the intent to take property, and that he was ready to harm to get it. The defense, however, shared another picture. They pointed to his troubled family life, exposure to substance use, neglect, and a pattern of reckless behavior from a young age. These details did not erase the harm of that night, but they shaped the defense's view that he was a troubled child, not a cold-hearted adult. The trial moved forward in 1989. Jurors listened to medical testimony about the victim's injuries. They heard police explain how they connected Vanzant to the house. Prosecutors insisted the act was deliberate. They told the jury that even at 14, he had shown a willingness to cause serious harm. They pressed for a first-degree conviction. Vanzant's lawyers stressed his age. They said a 14-year-old lacked the maturity and judgment to be treated like an adult. They emphasized his unstable home and his early exposure to substance use and neglect. In the end, the jury found him guilty of first-degree unlawful taking of life and other charges. Although he was only 14 at the time, Vanzant was tried in the adult system. He was sentenced on February 20th, 1991, to life imprisonment plus an additional term of 20 to 40 years. At that time, the law allowed adult-level punishments once the legal requirements were met, even for a young teenager. After sentencing, Vanzant tried many times to challenge the judgment. He filed several petitions under Pennsylvania's Post-Conviction Relief Act, but most were denied. For years, nothing changed. Then, starting in 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court and Pennsylvania courts issued rulings about mandatory life sentences for juveniles. These rulings required judges to consider the age, maturity, and potential for change in young offenders before giving the harshest penalties. This shift in the law gave Vanzant a chance to reopen his sentence. From late 2013 onward, he pressed for resentencing. In September 2018, a Philadelphia court vacated the old sentence. He was then resentenced to 31 years to life. This meant life imprisonment remained possible, but for the first time there was a minimum term with the possibility of parole. At first, the resentencing order also required him to take part in certain treatment programs and to register under specific conditions if he was ever granted parole. Later, when Vanzant filed further motions, those requirements were reduced. Legal arguments about these conditions continued, but in 2020, the Pennsylvania Superior Court confirmed the amended sentence. People often ask whether Vanzant showed remorse or tried to change in prison. Records and interviews suggest that over time he did. He took part in programs, attended counseling, and later became involved in groups that helped others prepare for life after prison. Supporters who knew him inside described a man who reflected deeply on his past and worked on himself. Others remained focused on the harm done to Margaret Boyle and her family. Both views shaped how the public saw his resentencing and release. In April 2019, after more than 30 years in prison, Vanzant was released on parole. He stepped into a city that had changed completely since his teenage years. Reports said he found steady work in awning, fabrication, and installation. He also began speaking publicly about justice reform and worked with groups such as Reform Alliance. His journey showed a stark contrast: a harmful act as a boy, decades behind bars, and then a role in shaping discussions about youth and punishment. This case leaves difficult questions. How should the justice system handle a 14-year-old who committed such serious harm? In recent years, courts have been told to consider youth and the possibility of change before giving life without parole sentences. In Vanzant's case, those changes in the law directly shaped his release. Yet, the pain felt by the victim's family and neighbors remains strong. For them, time served does not erase what happened. Official records and news reports show the timeline clearly. The arrest in 1988, the trial and conviction in 1989, the life sentence in 1991. Years of appeals. The resentencing in 2018 to 31 years to life, and the release on parole in 2019. But alongside those dates are human voices. The family members who lost someone dear, the prison mentors who watched him grow older inside, and the advocates who see his release as proof that young offenders deserve another look. That mix of law, loss, and change is what makes this case remembered and debated today. The next 19-year-old stood lookout while her boyfriend held a gun. Moments later, a man was gone. Marie's background was full of hardship. Court documents and legal filings described a childhood marked by mistreatment at home, running away, substance use, and long stretches of homelessness. Lawyers later argued that these struggles shaped her choices and pulled her into a destructive path. In 1973, when she was 19 years old, Marie and her boyfriend, 16-year-old Leroy Saxton, went into a Germantown gas station planning to steal money. Defense lawyers later said it was to feed their addiction. Marie claimed her role was only to act as lookout while Saxton confronted the attendant, Michael Kerrigan, a 35-year-old father and off-duty firefighter. During the theft, Kerrigan was shot in the back of the head and did not survive. Under Pennsylvania's felony homicide law, intent didn't matter. Even though Marie said she never pulled the trigger, the law treated the act as one shared act. She was convicted of second-degree homicide and sentenced to mandatory life without parole. Because of this rule, intent did not matter. If someone's life was lost during a felony, all participants could be charged with second-degree homicide. Critics argued this law punished people who did not directly cause the demise. Supporters said it kept everyone responsible for dangerous acts. In Marie's case, the law left no choice but a life sentence. She was convicted in Philadelphia County in 1974. She received a mandatory life term. Her other charges for conspiracy and aggravated robbery did not add to the punishment because the life sentence covered it all. At the time, judges had no flexibility. Saxton, the 16-year-old who actually fired the gun, was convicted of first-degree charges and also sentenced to life. Years later, legal changes helped people sentenced as children, and Saxton was released in 2020. But Marie, who was 19, did not qualify for those changes. That one-year age difference became a symbol of how uneven the system could be. The motive was money. Both Marie and Saxton were caught up in substance use, and the theft was meant to support that. Records showed there was no evidence Marie planned a shooting. Most reports described the gunfire as an escalation during the act, rather than something planned. At trial, the prosecution relied on eyewitnesses and physical evidence. Marie admitted to being part of the theft. The state argued that anyone involved in a dangerous felony that resulted in a life lost was responsible. The defense said Marie was only a lookout and never meant harm. They pointed to her age, her background, and her addiction as context. The jury sided with the prosecution. Marie was sentenced to life without parole. For more than 50 years, she remained in custody. During that time, she mentored others, painted, wrote, and even collected crocheted animals. Advocates later used these examples to show how she had changed. Her case also became part of broader legal fights about the fairness of mandatory life sentences under felony responsibility laws. Lawyers and groups argued that people who did not intend harm or played smaller roles should not be given life without parole. Marie joined these challenges, which reached higher courts in Pennsylvania. Some appeals focused on constitutional issues, arguing that people like her should at least have a chance at review. In 2025, the Pennsylvania Board of Pardons gave Marie a public hearing, which was rare. Later that year, Governor Josh Shapiro commuted her sentence. This meant she could appear before the parole board within 6 months and have a chance at release. The commutation included a condition. She had to serve a short additional period as punishment for escapes decades earlier. Even with that, the decision broke a decades-long standstill and opened the first real path toward freedom in her lifetime. By mid-2025, Marie's life sentence had been changed, giving her the possibility of parole. That did not mean automatic release. The parole board would consider her health, her record over decades in prison, and statements from families connected to the case. After more than 50 years, Marie finally had a chance at a different ending to her story. Marie spent over 50 years in custody. Next, hear about a 14-year-old whose baseball and anxiety turned into an incident that shocked a town. Joshua Phillips grew up in a household that many described as tense and difficult. He was born in 1984 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and later moved with his family to Jacksonville, Florida. Neighbors remembered him as a quiet, ordinary boy who played outside with other kids. He didn't stand out as someone who caused problems. Family history shared during court proceedings described his father as someone who drank heavily and could be harsh. His mother was often the one trying to keep peace in the home. Joshua himself had never been arrested or connected to aggressive behavior before the incident that would later define his life. On November 3, 1998, Joshua was outside playing with his 8-year-old neighbor and friend, Madeline Ray Maddie Clifton. According to what Joshua later told investigators, they were playing baseball when the ball hit Maddie in the eye. She started crying. Joshua panicked because he feared his father's reaction. What followed, prosecutors said, showed a series of actions that turned from panic into something much worse. Joshua brought Maddie into his house. Inside, he struck her with a baseball bat. He then hid her under the frame of his waterbed. Days went by while the neighborhood searched for Maddie. Joshua later told investigators that she was still alive after the first blows. When he found she was still breathing, he removed the mattress. He then used a sharp object to injure her throat and struck her several times. Investigators eventually found her under his bed during a search of his room. These details, the ball striking Maddie, Joshua's fear of his father, the repeated blows, and the hiding of her body, became the center of the prosecution's case. In court, prosecutors asked, why would a 14-year-old hide a body in his own bedroom while everyone else searched? Their answer was that Joshua feared punishment from his father. They argued that fear led him from panic to hiding Maddie, and then to further destructive choices. The defense painted the case differently. They said it began with an accident and spiraled out of control. Joshua claimed he never meant to end Maddie's life. He said the baseball caused the injury, and that his later actions came from fear and confusion, not from planning. Prosecutors responded by pointing out that dragging Maddie inside, hiding her, and not seeking help while the search was ongoing showed he understood what he had done and tried to cover it up. The defense also presented brain scans that suggested Joshua had damage in the part of the brain linked to judgment. The judge, however, did not allow all of that evidence. One key question came up again and again. Could Maddie have been saved if help had been called right away? Evidence showed there were moments when medical attention might have made a difference. Prosecutors said Joshua had the chance to get help, but chose not to. The defense said he was a terrified boy who made poor choices out of fear, not because he wanted Maddie gone. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. They found that Joshua's actions met the legal standard for first-degree homicide. He was arrested several days after Maddie went missing, once investigators found evidence connecting him to what happened. At his trial in 1999, Joshua was charged as an adult. The case drew intense attention, not only locally but across the country, because of the ages of both children and the shocking details. The jury convicted him of first-degree offense. Since Joshua was under 16, he could not face the harshest penalty. Instead, the court sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Jurors said they reached their decision quickly, and the judge handed down one of the harshest punishments allowed under state law. At sentencing, Maddie's family and community members gave emotional statements about the pain and loss they carried. On the other side, Joshua's family and lawyers asked for mercy, pointing to his young age and troubled home life. Over time, even some officials who had supported the life sentence later said they wished they had offered a plea deal, given that Joshua was only a child when this happened. The legal battle did not stop there. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional. That decision meant courts had to review each case and consider a young person's age, maturity, and potential for change before giving the harshest sentences. This ruling opened the door for Joshua to request a new hearing. In 2017, his lawyers presented evidence about his behavior in prison. They showed he had completed his GED, taken college classes by mail, worked as a paralegal to help other inmates, and joined counseling and religious programs. Prison staff also testified that he had only a small number of disciplinary issues and had mostly been cooperative. The prosecution, however, reminded the court of the original facts, stressing how severe the case was. The court again gave him a life sentence, though this time under rules that allowed periodic reviews. On appeal, the court upheld that decision, saying the new sentence still gave him a meaningful chance at release in the future through review hearings. Meanwhile, Maddie's family continued to oppose any reduction. They spoke publicly about the ongoing pain of losing her and urged judges not to shorten Joshua's sentence. In recent years, Joshua became eligible under Florida law to apply for another sentence review after serving a set number of years. Hearings for that review were reported for 2025. The court would weigh his prison record, expert testimony, the facts of the case, and the views of Maddie's family before deciding whether his sentence should change. The next 18-year-old grabbed a purse and ended up sentenced to life with no chance of release. Tyreem Rivers grew up in South Philadelphia. He was the youngest child in a working-class family. From an early age, school staff marked him as at risk. By his late teenage years, he had started using different kinds of illegal substances. This led him into small-time offenses. He was short in height, about 5 feet 5 inches, and weighed around 140 pounds. People who knew him described him as loud but also magnetic. Younger relatives often looked up to him. Later, as an adult in prison, Rivers said he could hardly recognize the person he had been at 18. Public records do not show a long history of harmful actions before the case that put him in prison for the rest of his life. The event that led to his conviction involved taking an elderly woman's purse, which ended with her being badly hurt and later passing away. Today, Rivers is one of many people in Pennsylvania serving life without parole under the state's felony-related rules. In 1996, Rivers followed an 85-year-old woman as she left a bank and walked toward her home in a Philadelphia neighborhood. She was carrying a black leather purse. Rivers pulled the purse away from her and ran off. Court records and later reporting state that he did not shove or hit her directly. But as she climbed the steps to her front door, she lost her balance. She fell down the stoop and broke several bones. She was taken to the hospital. Within 2 weeks, while still hospitalized, she developed infections. Her health declined. She eventually passed away from complications, including pneumonia, that were tied to those injuries. Prosecutors treated her passing as part of the chain of events that began with the purse being taken. This sequence matters because Pennsylvania law treats passings that occur during certain felonies differently from accidental outcomes. The felony homicide law in the state says that if someone passes during the course of certain felonies, the person committing the felony can be found guilty of second-degree charges. This applies even if the person did not mean for someone to lose their life. Rivers was arrested the same month the woman passed away. By the next year, he went to trial and was sentenced. A common question is, if Rivers only took a purse, why was he charged this way? The answer lies in Pennsylvania law. In that state, second-degree homicide applies when a passing occurs during a qualifying felony. Prosecutors argued that the purse snatching set in motion the events that led to the woman's passing. This made Rivers legally responsible under the law, even if he never intended to end her life. At trial, eyewitness testimony and medical records were the most important evidence. The woman's fall, her hospital treatment, the infections, and her final outcome were all documented and presented. Defense witnesses and even the judge noted that Rivers did not appear to have wanted to harm the woman. Judge David N. Savitt was later quoted saying, "He's a thief rather than someone who takes lives." Still, because of the way the law worked, the theft was directly tied to the woman's passing. The judge had no legal choice but to give the mandatory sentence for second-degree homicide. Reports showed that Rivers' main motive was money. His struggle with addiction and the need for cash pushed him to commit the purse snatching. There was no reliable proof that he intended to hurt the woman. The prosecution did not have to prove intent to harm or intent to take a life. Instead, they relied on the fact that the purse snatching caused the fall, which led to medical problems and her passing. That legal link is what turned a theft into a homicide case under Pennsylvania law. Rivers went to trial in 1997. The case was a bench trial, which means it was decided by a judge instead of a jury. After reviewing the evidence, the judge found him guilty of second degree under the felony rule. At that time, Pennsylvania law required a life sentence with no chance of release for this type of conviction. The judge followed the law and gave that sentence. The judge also made a comment during the hearing. He said Rivers was a thief rather than a taker of life. This showed the gap between what the judge personally believed and what the law forced him to decide. The court did not say Rivers directly caused the woman's passing on purpose. Instead, they said the purse snatching was the main reason behind the chain of events that led to her passing. That is different from saying he meant for her to lose her life. But under Pennsylvania's felony rule, just being part of the act that led to a loss of life was enough for the court to treat it as second degree. Because of that, Rivers got the harshest long-term punishment possible for such a case: life in prison with no chance of release. He became one of more than 1,000 people in Pennsylvania, serving life under the felony rule. Many of them were young and from minority backgrounds, which later became a major point in reform efforts and lawsuits. Rivers entered prison when he was still a teenager. His personal growth since then has been used by advocates as a reason for new sentencing or clemency. His case became part of a larger legal and political debate. The question was whether mandatory life without release for felony cases that cause unintended loss of lives is fair or even constitutional. Rivers became a named plaintiff in lawsuits that challenged Pennsylvania's system. Supporters of change argue that forcing a life sentence on someone who did not take a life or mean to do so is unfair and ignores the differences in responsibility among people involved. On the other side, prosecutors and opponents say the rule is important. They believe it keeps accomplices accountable and honors the pain of victims' families. This legal battle has moved through state courts and has become part of wider reform campaigns. From inside prison, Rivers has given several interviews. He has shown regret and talked about how he used his time to grow. He earned his high school diploma, studied further, mentored others, and joined treatment programs. In one interview, he said he is not a bad person and described himself as a man of change. He asked people to look at who he has become after decades inside. He also said he barely recognizes the 18-year-old version of himself. Reporters have repeated those words in stories covering his rehabilitation efforts. The woman's family has expressed a very different view. For them, the loss is permanent. One family member, her grandnephew, went to the trial and later said, "My aunt is gone forever." The family has continued to believe that a life sentence was the right outcome for a case that ended a life, even if it was not intentional. Their grief has stayed part of the public record, and it is one of the reasons courts and much of the public see these cases as very difficult to reopen. Today, Rivers is still held at the State Correctional Institution at Dallas in northeastern Pennsylvania. He remains under a life sentence with no chance of release. In the next case, a midnight fire tore through a row house. 2 boys never made it out, and suspicion quickly turned to a 14-year-old girl. Shortly after midnight on August 29, 1976, a row house at 1138 Spruce Street in Chester, Pennsylvania caught fire. The flames spread quickly from the first floor. Neighbors and investigators later identified the victims as 13-year-old Brian Harvey and his 6-year-old brother Derek. Within hours, authorities turned their attention to 2 local girls seen near the house that night. One of them was 14-year-old Trina Garnett. The official fire marshal's investigation concluded the fire had been started in more than one spot on the first floor. The state determined this was not an accident, but an intentionally set blaze. From the prosecution's perspective, the facts seem straightforward. Someone had entered the home, started the fire, and 2 children lost their lives from smoke and flames. The Commonwealth treated the case as arson that resulted in loss of life. Garnett was charged with several offenses, including arson, burglary, and 2 counts of second-degree charges related to loss of life. The case moved quickly into adult court. The jury trial began on March 14, 1977. The jury found her guilty on 2 counts of second-degree charges, as well as the related felony counts. Pennsylvania law at the time required a life sentence for second-degree cases. Garnett was sentenced to life in prison, with additional terms added for the other counts. Court documents focus heavily on the technical aspects, such as entering a home, lighting a fire, and the destruction that followed. But outside of the courtroom, Trina's life story painted a very different picture. She had endured years of hardship, neglect, and trauma. Advocates and psychiatrists later argued that her background should have been considered by the justice system. Trina was the youngest child in a very large family. Her mother passed away when she was still young. After that, her home life became unstable and cruel. Reports describe extreme poverty, repeated mistreatment, and periods when she and her family had no stable housing. As a child, she suffered severe burns that left permanent scars. School reports described her as struggling academically. She was diagnosed with learning and developmental impairments. At the time of her arrest, she was homeless and living with untreated emotional and mental health problems. Later, psychiatric evaluations measured her IQ in the borderline range and questioned her ability to fully understand or form a deliberate plan. When it came to motive, accounts differed. Some news reports suggested there had been a neighborhood dispute. Investigators believe Trina may have been angry because the boy's mother would not let her children play with her. They said she entered the house through a kitchen window and lit matches in several spots. The defense and later advocates gave another view. They argued that Trina was a traumatized and disabled child who may not have understood the consequences of her actions. They suggested she may have been lighting matches simply to see, or out of confusion, not with an intent to harm. The jury was instructed under Pennsylvania's felony rule, which meant that if someone set a fire and people lost their lives as a result, it could be treated as a homicide charge, even if there was no intent to cause loss of life. The prosecution said the evidence proved the fire was deliberately started in multiple places. The defense later argued she lacked the capacity and understanding to plan such an act. At her preliminary hearing, Chester police brought forward a long list of charges. She was tried as an adult, a decision that shaped the rest of her case. Court records show her trial counsel presented no defense witnesses during the guilt phase. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth called investigators and other witnesses to testify. The jury returned guilty verdicts for the charges, including arson, burglary, and the 2 counts connected to the loss of life. Post-trial motions were denied. The judge imposed life sentences, along with additional years for the other counts. There were many legal disputes about whether Trina Garnett fully understood her situation and whether she could properly take part in her defense. Different psychiatric reports gave different opinions. Some experts said she was not able to participate. Others said she was able. Later appeals and filings argued that her lawyers had not done enough for her. They pointed out that her defense team did not push harder to have her case handled in juvenile court. They also did not request deeper testing to check her mental abilities. In addition, they did not present enough background information at sentencing that might have helped reduce her punishment. The appeals court reviewed these claims in detail. The judges looked closely at whether the records proved she had not been able to participate in her trial. They also considered whether, even with concerns, the legal standard for overturning the case had been met. In the end, the courts rejected the arguments for a new trial or for canceling her conviction. The next big question was whether the fire was on purpose or an accident. Investigators found signs of more than one starting point on the first floor. Based on that, they concluded the fire had been set intentionally. Prosecutors relied on this to prove arson and to support the related charge. Her defense, later supported by advocacy groups, argued differently. They said her developmental struggles, her trauma, and the conflicting psychiatric reports raised real doubts about her intent. The courts, however, accepted the state's version of events and convicted her on second-degree charges and arson. Another major issue was whether Trina should have been handled in juvenile court instead of being tried as an adult. At that time in Pennsylvania, the law and the limited options in juvenile court gave judges very little flexibility. Records show the court did explore placement in juvenile facilities. They tried to find a program that would accept someone facing charges of arson and a related felony, but no juvenile facility was willing to take her. Because of this, and because of mandatory sentencing laws, Trina was transferred to adult court. Once she was convicted, the law required a life term. The judge had no power to shorten the sentence. This lack of choice upset the judge. Later summaries quote him calling the case one of the saddest he had ever seen. He expressed frustration that the system had no place for young people who needed both security and treatment. Trina was sent to an adult women's prison while still a teenager and began serving a life term. In the decades that followed, her case became a reference point in national debates about how children are sentenced. Civil rights groups, especially the Equal Justice Initiative, took up her case. They argued that Trina was a child with serious disabilities who had been treated as an adult and sent to spend her life in prison. They pointed out that mandatory life terms for children ignored science about brain development and removed the chance to consider personal circumstances. These arguments connected to a wave of cases that eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama in 2012. The court ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles violated the Constitution. The decision required individualized sentencing for young people. Later rulings explained how this should apply to earlier cases and made clear that many people serving such sentences should be resentenced. Trina's case was often mentioned in reports as an example of why those rulings mattered. Even with the Supreme Court's decisions, Trina's own journey has been very complex. Courts had to decide whether Miller applied to older cases and under what circumstances. In Pennsylvania and federal courts, her appeals often faced technical barriers. Judges reviewed questions about her mental state, her lawyer's performance, and whether new rulings applied to her. Some of her petitions were denied because of procedural rules. According to major reports, Trina remained in prison. Her story continued to be included in articles and advocacy efforts about young people serving life sentences. The next victim thought he was meeting his girlfriend, but what waited in the trails was something else entirely. Nicholas Coia grew up in Philadelphia, in a home that lacked stability. Adults who should have guided him were often absent. Later memoirs and accounts described the house as cluttered and neglected. People who knew the family said it felt like normal adult supervision was missing. Fast forward to spring 2003. Jason Sweeney was a 16-year-old construction worker living in Fishtown. He had just been paid $500. He was dating Justina Morley, a 15-year-old who had a long history of substance use, self-harm, and hospital stays. Unknown to Jason, Morley and Nicholas Coia, along with Nicholas's brother Domenic and their friend Edward Batzik Jr., planned to draw him to a wooded area near the Delaware River known as the Trails. They promised an intimate meeting to get him to go. The plan did not happen on impulse. The group listened to the song Helter Skelter by the Beatles many times. They later said the music helped them get ready for what they planned to do. That level of planning shows they thought about it ahead of time. When Jason went to the isolated spot, he was ambushed. Edward Batzig struck him first with a hatchet. The Coia brothers then joined in. They used a hammer, a rock, and a boulder. Batzig later said Jason begged for help while they kept hitting him. Jason told them to stop and said he was inured. His pleas did not stop what they were doing. Jason's injuries were severe. His head was crushed, and only one cheekbone stayed intact. After the incident, the teens took Jason's $500 and split it. They hugged each other afterward. They spent the money on substances and jewelry. They later described their behavior as extreme partying. Envy was part of the motive, not just theft. Jason had a job and some stability. The others resented that. A forensic psychologist and a detective later said the motive went beyond money and included deep resentment. In court, Nicholas Coia admitted they kept hitting Jason. He said they took Jason's wallet, split the money, and then partied. He also said they felt happy about what they did. Nicholas Coia made similar statements that showed a cold lack of feeling for the victim. In March 2005, Nicholas, who was then 16, Dominic, and Edward Batzig were tried as adults. They faced charges that included first-degree homicide, conspiracy, armed theft, and possession of a weapon. All were convicted. Because they were minors, the court could not impose the most extreme sentence that is sometimes available to adults. Instead, they were given mandatory life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional decades for the other convictions. The judge said the facts showed extreme cruelty. None of the teens apologized or showed remorse. When asked if he wanted to speak, Dominic made a joke and offered no real apology. That reaction angered people in the courtroom. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole for juveniles violated the Eighth Amendment. That decision allowed some people to seek new sentencing hearings, but Pennsylvania courts mostly denied retroactive relief for those already sentenced. Nicholas Coia's appeal was still pending. He was granted a resentencing hearing in 2015. Judge Sandy L.V. Bird kept the original sentence, saying no factors justified a reduced punishment. The judge noted that Nicholas had helped plan the act and had taken part in the harm that left Jason unidentifiable except by dental records. In the next case, jealousy over a boyfriend spiraled into something no one in Lampeter Township could imagine. Tabitha Buck grew up in a small Pennsylvania town. School hallways and the local mall were where teenagers spent most of their time. She went to school with Lori Show. They moved in the same social circle as Lisa Michelle Lambert and Lawrence Butch Yunkin. Investigators and later court testimony described tense friendships and ongoing fights between the girls. Over weeks and months, the interactions moved from name-calling and shoving to repeated following and physical fights. Those months led to an event that took Lori's life and changed many people forever. On the morning of December 20th, 1991, 16-year-old Lori Show was at her family home in Lampeter Township, Lancaster County. Her mother, Hazel Show, had been at the high school after being lured there under false pretenses. When Hazel came back home, she found her daughter badly injured. Lori had multiple sharp injuries, a deep cut across her throat, and more than 24 defensive wounds. The medical exam described a 5-inch cut across the throat and puncture wounds. Lori suffered severe injuries and did not survive. Her last audible words to her mother were reported as naming one of the people involved. Michelle did it. That short statement helped point investigators to the people who were charged that same day. Police acted quickly. Within hours, they arrested Lisa Lambert, Tabitha Buck, and Lawrence Yunkin at a local bowling alley. Officers noted fresh scratches on Buck's face and shoulders. Yunkin had minor wounds. Lambert did not show the defensive marks investigators expected. Inside Buck's purse, police found makeup items that belonged to Lori, including a compact and a tube of mascara. Those items suggested Buck had been at the house and left in a hurry. The prosecution used these physical details, scratches, the makeup, clothing, and tools bought the night before as part of its case. As the inquiry continued, investigators described a pattern of harassment and threats rather than a single isolated event. Lambert had been jealous after Lori briefly dated Yunkin. Lambert and Buck followed Lori at school and in public places. Witnesses described several hostile confrontations. Buck ran at Lori in a mall and began punching her. Another fight happened at a fireman's ball. There were also incidents at school. The prosecution argued the harassment and threats built up and that Lambert and Buck went to Lori's house expecting to intimidate her. They said the physicality that followed was planned and severe. At trial, the main cause given was jealousy and rage. Lambert's anger over Lori's relationship with Yunkin together with accusations that Lori had reported being inappropriately harmed by Youngkin, led to continued harassment. Prosecutors said that anger turned into a plan to confront, frighten, and then harm Lori. Witnesses said Lambert had spoken about wanting to scare Lori, then hurt her, then cut her throat. The day before the incident, Youngkin bought hats, rope, and gloves at a Kmart and drove Lambert and Buck to places linked to the event. When the act happened, it was swift and severe. The prosecution presented jealousy as a clear motive and argued Buck played an active role. A common question about this case is whether Tabitha Buck carried out the main attack or acted as a helper. At trial, the jury found Buck legally responsible for the fatal incident, even though the exact order of actions between Lambert and Buck remained disputed. Physical evidence scratches on Buck, the items from Lori found in her purse, and Buck's knowledge of Lori's schedule placed her at the scene. Testimony from Youngkin and others also connected Buck to the event. The jury weighed that evidence and returned a guilty verdict in relation to the fatal incident. Another question is whether Youngkin took part in the actual cutting. Youngkin gave different accounts at different times. He usually described himself as a driver and helper who did not make the fatal cuts. Later testimony and plea deals made his story more complicated. Youngkin pleaded guilty to a lesser third-degree charge connected to the incident and received a significantly lighter sentence than the women. His cooperation and changing statements were central to arguments by both the prosecution and the defense during trials and appeals. Trials and appeals followed in the years after the event. Lisa Michelle Lambert was found guilty in 1992 of first-degree charges and conspiracy. Tabitha Buck's case took a different path. Buck was convicted and originally given life without the chance of parole. Some official records describe her conviction as a second-degree finding, reflecting how the jury viewed her role. Youngkin, who was 20 at the time, later pleaded guilty to a third-degree charge in exchange for cooperation and received a 10 to 20-year sentence. The different charges and outcomes reflected each person's role, the evidence presented, and the plea deals offered during the long legal process. Court testimony included difficult, specific material. The prosecution showed red-stained clothing, testimony about purchases made the night before, and witness accounts of threats and past aggressiveness. In closing arguments, both sides tried to shape the jury's view of what each defendant did that morning. Defense lawyers said their clients had been misrepresented and that witness accounts, including Youngkin's, were not fully reliable. The jury ultimately convicted Lambert and Buck, and the sentences reflected how the court treated their roles at that time. The case did not end with the first convictions. Over the years, the legal picture changed. Parts of Lambert's conviction were overturned at times and later reinstated. For Tabitha Buck, a major change came decades later when U.S. Supreme Court decisions limited mandatory life without parole for people who were juveniles when they committed crimes. Those rulings required states to re-examine sentences for people who had been under 18 at the time of their offenses. Buck was resentenced in 2017 to a term of 28 years to life. That new sentence opened the possibility of parole. On December 21, 2019, the Pennsylvania Board of Probation and Parole granted Buck parole. She was released after serving nearly 28 years in prison. That legal change was not about proving innocence. It was about how juveniles should be sentenced under changing constitutional standards. People who followed the case felt split. Some said the new sentence introduced a fairness measure for someone sentenced as a minor. Others felt the original punishment matched the seriousness of the event. Courts across the country faced similar questions. This case became one of several where old juvenile sentences were re-examined. As of the most recent reporting, Tabitha Buck was released on parole in December 2019 after being resentenced in 2017. She is no longer described as serving life without parole. Lori's surviving family, local news outlets, and the community continue to follow the story. Lori's mother became an advocate for stronger anti-following and harassment laws after the incident. The case left a long public trace through court rulings, media coverage, a book, and a made-for-television movie. It also influenced local law and public discussion for many years.